Hi guys, it looks as if I'm doing another reaction video, and in this case, I have to express my appreciation. Dr. Rhonda Patrick got back to my response with a very lengthy one of her own. It also was very thoughtful, and I very much appreciate it. And just to get meta with you all, I hope you'll follow my spirit and try to keep this as kind and as respectful as I appreciate. So here we go. Thanks for the high level and thoughtful comments, Real Dave Feldman. I also appreciate you sharing your recently published paper. It's encouraging to see this important research being pursued. Thank you. While I agree with you that leanness and metabolic health likely play a crucial role in long-term outcomes, I believe it's important to consider that even metabolically healthy individuals could benefit from lower LDL cholesterol levels, though I'm inclined to focus on ApoB. The data I'm citing here is specific to LDL cholesterol. This aligns with Lane's point that lean mass hyperresponders might be healthier in terms of reduced heart disease risk if their LDL particles were lower. By healthier, I'm specifically referring to a lower risk for heart disease. Would you disagree with that? Is there any data that suggests otherwise? Well, firstly, I think it's absolutely fair to consider lean mass hyperresponders may reduce their risk of heart disease by taking steps to lower their LDL cholesterol. I certainly would want everything to be considered and kept on the table. But in answer to your question, is there any data to suggest otherwise? Ours is the most specific to lean mass hyperresponders that I'm aware of. To the best of our knowledge, there has never been a prospective study on a population with extremely high LDL cholesterol that doesn't include or exclusively focus on a population with some form of dysfunctional lipid metabolism, either one that they're born with, like monogenetic FH, or acquired, such as insulin resistance syndrome. So it's worth emphasizing this, because these dysfunctions are independent risk factors for cardiovascular disease in and of themselves, which by definition makes them confounders. I'll again state, this study is just one of many more steps to come, but it's the giant first step we've been waiting for. Nothing like this has been attempted before now, which is why our data set is in a class of its own. Mendelian randomization studies are compelling because they examine LDL cholesterol effects across a diverse population, including both metabolically healthy and unhealthy individuals. These studies consistently show that even metabolically healthy individuals with higher genetically determined LDL cholesterol levels have shorter lifespans, while those with lower LDL cholesterol live longer. First of all, higher LDL cholesterol associated with greater mortality isn't surprising, but this is because it wraps in various forms of dysfunctional lipid metabolism that I just mentioned from above. And you can often see this when you're wrapping in things like the triglycerides and HDL in the context of the genetic components. But a more interesting and compelling question is one of lifelong low LDL cholesterol, or ApoB, and longevity. This is the latter part of your assertion, and I'd agree, it would be extremely compelling if a sizable population born with genetically lower LDL cholesterol, like PCSK9 loss of function, had a clear signal of longevity when compared to the general population. But while I hear this repeated over and over, I've yet to see this in the data. Some of my colleagues are looking into a large data set to confirm or disconfirm this themselves to answer the question, would those with lifelong low LDL cholesterol in fact show a longer lifespan? So I can better comment on this when their analysis comes back. For example, a 2021 study found that a 1 standard deviation increase in genetically proxied LDL cholesterol reduced slight. So this is the catch with the proxies, the scoring, and so forth. This is kind of where I start. I'll concede this is where I get my strongest pushback with MR, but I'll pause and continue. I'll just read on. And decrease the odds of reaching the 90th percentile age by 28%. Another study linked genetically lowered LDL cholesterol with reduced frailty in older adults, especially those over 60. Additionally, higher ApoB and LDL cholesterol levels have been associated with shorter health span and an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. While I have some strong opinions on MR studies, I deferred instead to my colleague Adrian Sotomoda, as this should be unpacked in its own context, and it can take a while to do so. But short version for me, I think MR studies are very interesting, definitely. But I also just don't share the same level of confidence many have to make a conclusive case of independent causality. I found the recent lean mass hypersponder study very interesting, but I'm still left wondering if the study's 5-year time frame is sufficient to override the apparent risks of lifelong high LDL exposure noted in the MR studies. As BioLane mentioned, heart disease develops over a long period. It's worth clearing the air on this, as it's a common misconception. Yes, it can take very long time to develop symptomatic atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, the kind of advanced disease that doesn't require a scan, but which you can feel not just worse, but you might actually die of. Our study is using ultra-high resolution CT angiography, so it can detect plaque at less than a cubic millimeter or even less in many cases. We're using advanced AI-guided reading for quantified analysis. Many longitudinal CTA studies are typically 1 year because they detect changes in plaque that quickly. The absence of coronary artery calcification in lean mass hypersponder individuals on a ketogenic diet for under 5 years and presumably exposed to higher LDL for just as long is, in my opinion, not strong enough evidence to dismiss the link between high LDL and heart disease over a lifetime. Additionally, CAC has its limitations and doesn't capture the full picture, as you're undoubtedly aware. Yes, our study isn't using CAC alone. We're using CT angiography. We're capturing both calcified and non-calcified plaque. A short-term study like this doesn't provide a definitive answer, though it certainly contributes valuable data. Assessing ApoB and LDL particle numbers, factors also associated with reduced health span, remain crucial. I agree, it doesn't provide a definitive answer. Almost no study does. That said, it's already providing data I had long been speculating on for some time. The following scatter plot is from a presentation on preliminary data from this same study. It's not yet published, so take that in consideration. But within our cohort, there is no correlation between LDL particle count, this isn't just LDL cholesterol, LDL-P, and corresponding plaque volume. And this brings me back to time span. With respect, I genuinely think many amazing smart people are unknowingly holding us to a different standard. Think about this. Most interventional studies of LDL cholesterol change and corresponding outcomes of cardiovascular disease are shorter than 4.7 years. In fact, the Jupiter trial was just 1.9, and it was one of the most influential studies ever. So unless you believe these changes to LDL cholesterol for those trials could alter events without changing plaque in any way, then to be consistent, you'd have to agree that 4.7 years at these magnitudes of increased LDL cholesterol for our cohort, for our study, they are more than sufficient to expect changes in plaque. I'm not being defensive here. I genuinely appreciate our constructive discussion on this topic, as there's much to learn from both perspectives. Can I make a polite challenge on this note? Would you consider having myself and Nick Norwitz on your podcast to discuss this research directly? The low-carbon carnivore community are often spoken of in a not-so-favorable light, and I think it's fair to call out the extremes. But that said, I've been spearheading this study for a long time, and if you believe, as I do, that we should encourage good science, why not have us on to discuss this directly? She goes on to say, for reference, here's the MR study. Here's the MR study that Lane and I discussed in the clip. It shows the prolonged exposure to lower LDL cholesterol was associated with greater. And again, this is where there's kind of, I think there's a lot of impressions, as Lane was showing, that I think a lot of people take, that you can draw this straight line from exposure to what it is. But sort of in the way that you're describing it here, a lot of these studies are on exposure to lowering, which is technically an important nuance to pick up, and why it is that it's important to wrap this into the larger picture of how it is that we're looking at these data and their outcomes. I'll finish with one last thought, which is that I appreciate that a mutual friend of ours, Dr. Peter Attia, challenged me 6 years ago to try to raise funds from the low-carb community to literally get this studied. And that's literally where we're at right now. Like, as of this moment, as of this week, these are the first data that's published from a study that I was able to crowdsource and have completed. And I think now's the time to talk about it. It's either the time to talk about it or it's the time to not talk about it. But obviously I would encourage that we actually take a serious look at these data and what they can mean to us all. Thank you so much for taking the time to respond, and I appreciate hearing your thoughts.